Jock here. Two things that I want to explain to you in this video. Number one, I want to explain why use Docker. I want to show you 5 reasons why using Docker is so critical for local development. And the second thing is I'm going to show you how to create it, how to put it together, and how to use it in your local development environment. Quick thing, this video is part of a 5-hour video where I explain how to develop a website from start to finish. Make sure to check it in the description below. Now, this video specifically though, it's all about Docker. I want to talk about why Docker is so critical and so important for the modern developer of today. Now, here's 5 reasons why I feel like Docker is a fantastic local dev platform to use. Number 1, uniform dev environments for all. The nice thing about having a uniform dev environment is it's the same setup across everything, which means you don't have to do different type of setups or setup environments. It's literally opening up Docker, hitting the command line, and it is good to go. The second reason why I feel like Docker is super important is because of project isolation, meaning that every single instance or container is running in its own little node. The main thing is that it's completely isolated. Now, why is that important? Well, the primary reason, and the reason I feel like it's important, is for security reasons. The nice thing is if you ever have a website that is compromised, it can spread because it is contained in its own isolation container. The third reason why I love using Docker is because it is easy to set up. Like I said earlier, you literally just take the command line, type in a few words, and you are good to go. The fourth thing is mirror your production or development environment. What I mean about that is you can reuse Docker image or container configuration. You can spin up multiple containers or images by just going to the command line and typing in a command. The fifth reason is efficiency. It is all about being as quick and as efficient as possible. In this video, what we will do is I'll show you how to set that up correctly, but all of this is key to make sure that you are efficient, that your development environment is secure, and it is easy to set up. That's what it's all about. So stick around and let me show you how to set up your own local dev environment using Docker coming up. Now, there's a few things that I need you to have to be able to do this entire course. The first one is GitHub. So make sure to navigate to GitHub. If you don't have GitHub installed on your computer, you also need to do that. You also need to install or download and install GitHub, and that's quite easy to do. You can literally just search GitHub download, and you can download the GitHub onto your computer. Now, there is 2 different versions. There's GitHub Desktop. You can also download and install that. But the primary one you do need is this one right here. So it is Git itself. It is a pretty old school site for sure. Don't be alarmed. That's how it looks like. And depending on what operating system you're running on, you're just going to download and install that. Now, just for reference, I am running this obviously on a Windows PC. The next thing you would need is, and I know this sounds pretty obvious, but you need Visual Studio Code. Make sure to download Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code for that matter, because there's 2 different versions. There's Visual Studio, which is a paid one, and then there's Visual Studio Code. Okay, so the next thing you're also going to need is Docker. So make sure you have a Docker account. Again, the same as GitHub. It's a quick and easy way to quickly register an account. Once you've registered it, you are going to download it onto your local desktop or Mac or Linux environment, and make sure to run the prompts to properly install that. So that is Docker Hub. So with that done, the next one you would need is Node.js. So again, just going to Google or Bing and searching download Node.js. This kind of is a little confusing. The one that you want to select is this one, the latest one, version 20. That's the most stable version to run. This will give you the ability to use NPM, which we are going to use throughout this entire course. Now, with Node.js done, the next thing you're going to need is Python. Here I have, because I'm using, again, Windows, I have the Windows version. So you want to download the latest of that, which in this case is going to be Python 3.1.2. So make sure to download and install that as well. Super important. Okay, so that's it. Once you've installed everything and activated, and by the way, you can just pause this video and do that real quick. Once you have that all done, we can start. And what we're going to start with is creating our GitHub repository. And then we are going to configure our Visual Studio Code to be able to accommodate that. Okay, so navigate over to GitHub. And we are going to create a new repository for this Yoga Fitness Studio website. On the top left-hand side of the screen, you would see a button that says new. So we're going to click on that and we're going to go and create this new repository. So the first thing we need to do is give it a name. So I'm going to click where it says repository name. I'm going to click on that and we're going to type in, I'm going to use yoga web. You know what? Let's say yoga fitness website. One thing you're going to notice, we need to make sure that it is available. So when I created this tutorial, obviously I've already used Yoga Fitness, so you won't be able to use it. Make sure to create something unique. You can also add a description. With any type of development I do, I like to add a description. So I'm just going to say yoga fitness website. Now here's two options you can choose. You can either choose public or private. Now I advise you to go with private. I'm going to select public because I am going to share all the files with you. And I'm also going to click on add a README file. We'll jump into the whole README file later on. Now with that all selected, we also have add git ignore, which at this point is fine. If we have a more specific project that we're going to work with, we'll definitely select it here and it will be pre-baked. But as we set up our environment, we're also going to configure our git ignore file in Visual Studio Code. All right, so git ignore done. The last part is the choose license part. Again, this part you don't really need to worry about. Why? Because you are not going to put your files on public repository. You're going to keep it private. But I'm going to put this on a public repository. So I would need to select a specific license. I'm going to go for the MIT license, which is a very common one. One thing you're also going to see is that it's going to pre-create a branch for us, which is going to be called main, which is fine. We are probably going to change it later on, maybe not. We'll see how this course progresses. So once that's all done, we're going to click create repository. Now this takes a second or two and it is done. So now we have our repository. It is done. Mine says Yoga Fitness website at the top. You'll see that it has the license and it has the README file. The README file is the actual file that explains what this all is about. In the description below of this video, you would have full access to this. You can fork this as well, by the way. And everything that we are going through in this course is also going to be in this README file as well as the description below. All right, so that is done. We created our repository. The next thing is we need to physically clone this to our Visual Studio Code environment. Now, again, just recapping here real quick, we want to make sure that we install Docker. We want to make sure we installed Visual Studio Code and Python, but also successfully installed the GitHub part, the Git part, because if you haven't installed this properly, the next step is not going to work. But 99.99999% of the time, you won't have any issues. Once you've installed this and configured it, you should be good to go. All right, so with that done, let's navigate back to our GitHub pages or our GitHub repository. We can see we have the Yoga Fitness website repository right here. Now, there's a few ways to clone this to your Visual Studio Code environment. One thing I do not want you to do is when you click on this button, it's a little strange, but it says open in Visual Studio. So you would think, hey, let's click on that button. That would be the easy way to physically open it up, but it's not opening up the right Visual Studio. It's actually opening up Visual Studio Pro, which is the paid version. So it's not opening up Visual Studio Code. So we're not going to go for that. We can, however, click on the clone button over here, but there's an easier way to do this. So with that said, what I want you to do is once you've installed and download Visual Studio Code, we are going to now clone this repository to that Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to open up mine and I've already logged in to my Visual Studio Code. So on the bottom left side, you can sign in with your GitHub account. So I've already signed in. Make sure to sign in. Otherwise, this part is not going to work. Now, once you've signed in, we are now going to clone our actual repository. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to navigate over to my source control. So now what we're going to do is we're going to click on clone repository. When you click on this button, you're going to see a pop-up appear in the middle part of the screen. And we are going to click on clone from GitHub because that's what we're going to do. By the way, this will only work if you are properly signed in to your account. So I'm going to click on clone with GitHub. We're going to select the yoga fitness website. And when you do that, by the way, you're going to notice that a pop-up will appear. And this pop-up part, it is actually asking you, hey, where am I supposed to save this? I'm going to save it within my Repos folder, and I'm just going to create a random folder for this. So I'm going to call it yoga website, and you don't want to use any spacing for this. Once you've done that, we're going to select that folder and we're going to say select as repository destination. All right, so with that done, it's going to ask you, would you like to clone this repository? I'm going to say yes. So you're going to open that and we're going to wait for a second for that to open up. So now you can see that we have successfully opened up our GitHub repository. It's saying on the left-hand side, yoga fitness website, it's saying license and it's saying README. So at this point, it is pretty basic. We don't have anything in this project. It is super slim, but now we are going to start creating our environment. And specifically, we are going to create the Python Flask environment where our static website is going to reside. The first thing I normally like to do is just close this welcome screen. That's not really needed, but we are going to click in the yoga fitness area in the file area, and we're going to say open integrated terminal. So this normally takes a sec. And by the way, it's going to open up PowerShell. So on the right-hand side here, you're going to see PowerShell. Now you can technically change it. One thing you're also going to notice on the left-hand side is the actual source control. So source control is going to be activated and ready to go. All right, now we are going to set up the actual Python Flask environment. This is where the fun starts. So again, make sure that Node.js is successfully installed. Make sure Python is installed. And also make sure your Docker is installed. We'll get to the Docker here in a very short while, but let's start with the Python Flask. One thing I like to do before I do anything is just to make sure everything is properly installed. The quick and easy way to do this, and we're going to start with Python, is you open up the terminal and you're going to type in Python -uppercase V. And we want to see the Python version. If you see Python 3.11.7, you are good to go. If it says that it doesn't understand or recognize Python, then you would need to go back and try and install it again. But in most cases, you should be good to go. We're also going to do the same with Node. To check if Node is installed, you're going to type on npm -lowercase v in this case, and it's going to show you 8.15, which is good to go. So the first thing we want to do on the left-hand side is we want to create a new file. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to type in app.py. So py is for Python applications. So the system would know, hey, this is going to be a Python application. And on top of that, we also going to create a new file, and we are going to type in requirements.txt. With Python, you always need a requirements file and you need a Python file. The requirements file is essentially telling it what type of environment it's going to be, and the app.py file is going to physically tell it what is the instances or what exactly are we doing within this application. So I'm going to start with requirements. I'm going to navigate back and we're going to type in Flask just like that. And we're going to hit save. Now it knows that it's going to be a Flask application. So I'm going to close this. We're going to get back to the requirements in a sec. So we're going to start with adding our Flask. So to do that, we're going to say from Flask and we're going to say import Flask. All right, so with that done, the next step now is we are going to say app equals Flask, and we're just going to give it a name. So I'm just going to say name. Okay, perfect. Next, we're going to set up a route. So I'm going to use the app symbol, type in app, and we're going to type in route, and we are going to give it a /. And essentially what you're doing here is you're saying, hey, listen, this is where the main page is going to be. So later on, we're going to change this for sure. With that done, we are going to define a function. So in Python or .py file, defining a function, you type in def, and we're just going to say hello world. And this is literally just testing if everything is going to work the way that we want it. So I'm just going to type in world. And by the way, just to add to it, this part, this hello world, that's the actual name of the function. So I'm going to hit enter, and you're going to see that it is going to indent it. So in Python, you don't have open and closing brackets, you have indentation. So I'm going to type in return because we're returning, and we are returning hello world. So I'm going to say hello world. There we go. Last but not least, we're going to get out of that function. So you're going to type enter twice or press enter twice, and you're going to say if name, which is referring to this app here at the top, equals, and we're going to say main. And with that, now we've opened up an if function. We called it name. We said equals main. We're going to say app.run debug equals true. All right, so those are the basics. Now you're going to notice that sometimes it's going to give some squiggly lines where it's going to say that Flask cannot be imported, which you can just ignore at this stage. It's not super important. Now with this done, we are going to navigate back to our requirements file. We are going to make sure that we have Flask there, which is good. Now we've essentially created the base for our Python application. The next step is we need to set up our src and dist files. So src stands for source and dist stands for distribution, so our end goal. And throughout this course, I'm going to show you how to navigate between those. But let's go ahead and create a new folder. I'm going to call it src, and we're going to create a new folder again, and we're going to call it dist. Perfect. So now we have our src and our dist file. Now, one thing I want to change is this lowercase flask. The thing with Python is it is case sensitive. So we want to make sure that it says uppercase Flask like that. So it's going to say from Flask, import Flask. Another thing that I want to add to my actual Python code is we need to specifically set what host file and port it needs to use because we are using Docker to do all this. So we created this if function. We said name equals main, app run debug true. So I'm going to change that, and we just need to add the host. So I'm going to clear that up, and I'm going to say app.run. We're going to open up our brackets, and we are going to say host equals, and we're going to set it to 0000 port 5000. Because we are using Docker, we need to physically go and set that. If we didn't use Docker, we didn't need to do this, but in our case, we are using Docker. So I'm just going to say debug equals true. Okay, perfect. Now I'm going to hit save. Now, if you have Docker open, that's great, but we're going to close two of these tabs. We're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it Dockerfile. Perfect. Now, this is the Dockerfile. You're not going to add any extensions. It's going to be just Dockerfile, and we're going to start adding our Docker code. So we're going to start with from, and we're going to say Python 3.8, and we are going to run it on a slim version. Next, I'm going to say work directory. So I'm just going to hit the tab button and just make things a lot easier. And I'm just going to say /app. Next, we're going to say copy. And we're going to say requirements.txt, leave it with a little dot at the end. That's part of Docker's way of doing it. Next, we're going to say run, and we're going to say pip for Python. So pip install, and we're going to say, what do we want install? We want requirements.txt. All right, perfect. Next, we're going to copy everything. So we're just going to say copy, and I want to copy everything at this point. So we're just going to say dot and then dot again. We need to open up a port now. So I'm going to say expose, and we're going to open up 5000. Last but not least, we're going to say cmd python, comma, open up our quotations again, and we're going to say app.py. Perfect. Going to hit save, and now we have a basic Docker file ready to go. So now we need to go and actually run this Python file. So to do that, we are going to build it first before we can run it. So we're going to go to the terminal. We're going to type in docker build We're going to say T and we're going to give it a name. Now the name needs to be all lowercase. So I'm going to say fitness and we're going to hit enter. And essentially what it's doing now, it's building the entire environment for us. Good, that's all done. So when we navigate over to our actual physical Docker desktop environment, you're going to notice that it's going to say yoga fitness over here. And sometimes, not always, I think you need to run it before it actually shows the container, but it's not showing the container yet, but we'll definitely do that in a second. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code and let's run this Docker container. So I'm going to type in Docker run and we're going to give it a port. So I want it to be on port 5000 and you're going to say 5000 again. And we need to tell it what it is. So it's a yoga fitness that we want to run. Let's hit enter. And there we go. Now you're going to see one quick thing. When you activate or run Flask, it's always going to give you this warning where it says that, hey, this is a development server. And the reason it's doing that is because in our app.py, we actually said debug true. So it's giving us this, that, hey, this is not for production, but for development. So in our case, absolutely fine. So I'm going to click on this and we're going to open up. And once we click on that link, you are going to see, hey, hello world is here. So it's perfect. So our environment, our base environment is set up and is ready to go. Now that we have the base up and running, which in our case is hello world, we're actually going to tell Python to physically host and run a local HTML or templates folder for that matter. So going back to our app, we're going to modify this a little bit so that we can actually achieve that. So at the very first line, we're going to add render template. Once that's done, we're going to go to our dev hello world. We're going to take out this entire function. We're going to create a new one. We're going to add dev index, open up that function. We're going to say return render underscore template. And we're going to tell it what do we want to render, which is index.html. Perfect. Next, we're going to modify our app equals Flask. And within the brackets, I'm going to add a comma. And I'm going to say template underscore folder. And we're going to say equals src / templates. All right, so now with that done, let me explain what I did. We essentially told the Flask application, the Python application, that what I want you to render is within src and it is a folder called templates. Next, we need to physically create that folder. So on the left-hand side, where it says src, which is our folder, we're going to right click and create a new folder. We're going to call it template. So you'll see that when you create an empty folder within an empty folder in Visual Studio Code, it is going to truncate it. Next, I want to right click on template and we're going to add index.html. So let's quickly recap. When I go back to my app.py file, we essentially told it, hey, run the following template folder src templates, which is src templates. And within that, we created a function, we called it index, and we said render template index.html. So now with that all done, we are going to open up our integrated terminal and we're going to rebuild this Python application to our Docker container. So using the up arrow, you can reuse what you've already typed in. It just saves a lot of time. Look for Docker build T yoga fitness, the period at the end, and hit enter. Now it's going to rebuild that image. Once it's successfully built and you don't have any errors, we're going to run it just to double check that our index.html file is physically working. But I just realized that we didn't put anything in our index.html file, which means that if we would run it now, nothing will physically show. So I've got a pre-made, very simplistic HTML that I'm just going to paste within. By the way, I have all the commands and instructions in the description of this video below. So make sure to check that out so that you don't miss anything. So once it's done, we're going to hit Control S. We're going to save this index.html. And with that, we need to rebuild the Docker to make sure that everything works the way it's supposed to work. Once it's successfully built, I'm going to type in Docker run. We're going to add a port 5000, 5000, and we're going to call it yoga fitness. Get that to run up. Again, development. We're going to click on that link and we're going to see if we can see our actual index.html, which is good. At this stage, it is working. The last step before we move on to the next chapter of this video, or the next video for that matter, we need to sync or map the Docker container with our repository. So going back to Visual Studio, we're going to close and exit this specific instance, we're going to close or kill this development server by hitting Control-C. Once this is done, one thing I like to do when working with Docker is prune any images that is not being used. So you can use Docker image prune, and this will kill any dangling images is what they call it. These are images that have been created while we are building the Docker containers that is not currently being used. So it just cleans out the Docker for us. All right, so now with that, we are going to map our repository with our Docker container. To do this, we need to run the Docker again, but we're going to add a little bit more to it. So let's start with Docker run. We're going to set the port, which is 5000. And now we're going to add V, and this is where we're going to map our actual files or folders for that matter. So I'm going to start with a $, open up brackets. And when you're on a Windows PC, it's going to be uppercase PWD. When you're on a Mac or Linux, it's going to be lowercase pwd. We're going to say /src app src. Then we're also going to do the same for the app.py. So we're going to say v again, $, open brackets. I'm going to say pwd /app.py semicolon /app/app.py. And we're going to finish this off by saying yoga fitness. I'm going to hit enter. Okay, so I'm getting a quick error here, and the reason why it's doing that is because we are not in the actual root directory. I've just realized that we are within the src. So I'm just going to go back again, and let's run that again. I'm going to hit the up arrow and hit enter. You might have not got the error, but I sure did. So it's good this happened, because if you see this type of error in the future, you would know that you are not in the root directory where the Docker file is located. All right, I'm going to click on this link and let's see if it works. All right, so it's working. Let's double check and make sure everything is working the way it's supposed to. I'm going to make a few changes here. So I'm going to say, welcome to my website. I'm just going to change this heading. I'm just going to say this is a test. I'm going to save it, navigate back to the browser and hit refresh. And there you go. All right, so at this stage, we have successfully created our Docker container, and we've also created a local Python Flask app. And all of this is running in an image in Docker, which is exactly what we want. Next up, I'm going to show you how to set up Grunt and how to set up a task manager to do all this for you in a seamless and easy way.